William James and Functionalism, Part 1. An Introduction. History of Psychology. Professor Mike Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. William James was one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century and still is a towering figure in our field. He is the first major American psychologist, and he had an extremely wide range of interest, from physiology, psychology, to philosophy. He didn't have a dedicated system. Rather, he kind of picked up a pebble on the beach and played with it until he found a new shiny one that he wanted to play with. In this series of video lectures on William James, I'm going to explore some of his basic findings and look at his contributions to the field. In this introductory comment, in this introductory video, we're going to learn a little bit about William James and some of his ideas. In other videos, we'll look at more detailed parts of his theory. William James came from a wealthy background. His grandfather invested wisely in business after immigrating from Ireland and made several $1 million. Henry James Sr., William's father, didn't work and lived off of the family fortune. James's father was an extremely eccentric individual, and in terms of our discussion with William James, he sought to get the best education for his children. He did this by moving the family around extensively in both the United States and Europe, and James's father had the goal of securing the best education for his children. When he didn't think that American education was good enough for his children, he moved to Europe, and the children studied in European schools. When he thought the children were becoming too, quote-unquote, European, he moved the family back to the States. William James's brother was Henry James, the famous novelist. Oh, here are two James brothers, wrong ones. Here's William James, Henry James, William's wife Alice, and daughter Peggy, in Cambridge around 1905. William James was appointed to Harvard in 1872 as a physiologist. Remember, before this time, most of the individuals that were in the new field of psychology were working in departments of philosophy and physiology and the such. William James also set up the first demonstration lab in psychology at Harvard in 1879. James also set up the first demonstration lab for the teaching of psychology at Harvard in 1875. Some individuals contend that this is the first psychological laboratory set up by an individual in the world, and you should remember that Wundt set his laboratory up in what year? You better have said 1879. James usually doesn't get credit for the first psychological laboratory, as this was a laboratory for teaching and demonstration and not for research. One of James's most prolific accomplishments was the publication of the Principles of Psychology. It took him 12 years to write it, and it was a constant burden on him during that time. He had extremely mixed feelings about the book. However, it became a standard in American psychology. Now, Principles of Psychology contained over 1,400 pages, which made it impractical to use as a textbook for a semester class. So James later produced a smaller version of the Principles, which was known by the cutesy name Jimmy instead of James. One of James's most important ideas, and one that he followed in his career, was the idea of pragmatism. And basic notion of pragmatism is if an idea works, it is a valid one. Now, there might be some contentions about this, but James used this to study a variety of things, and his pragmatism led to a kind of scattered body of research exploring different ideas and areas with different methods as he saw fit, or basically ones that pragmatically worked. James said the most important ideas are the ones that are useful. Even if they're not a perfect idea, even if they don't reflect the world accurately, they're useful and they can be amended later to more accurately represent what the world looks like. From his pragmatic notions, he developed two types of personalities: the tough-minded and the tender-minded. Let's look at tender-minded first. If you look here are some trait descriptive adjectives for the tender-minded personality. You see they tend to be rationalistic, intellectual, idealist, optimistic, religious, dogmatic, and they believe in the concept of free will. This is contrasted with the tough-minded individuals, who are sensationalistic, materialistic, pessimistic, skeptical, and finally fatalistic. Sounds like a nice bunch of descriptors. William James said that someplace in the middle is the right way of thinking about things between tough-mindedness and tender-mindedness. However, as it is for the case of most things, it's really hard to study stuff in the middle. One of William James's most important ideas is the notion of the stream of consciousness. This goes back to Heraclitus, the famous Greek philosopher, who by analogy said no one can step into the same river twice. James said we could never have the same thought the same way twice, and that our consciousness is constantly an ebb and flow. Let's look at some of the components of William James's notion of consciousness. First of all, stream of consciousness is personal. My stream of consciousness is fundamentally different than yours and still different from any other person. We have a stream of consciousness that in turn is partially based on our past experiences, which may guide us to what we're thinking about at any moment. And since we all have different past backgrounds, our stream of consciousness will be extremely personal. Second point, the stream of consciousness is continuous. The second point also fits in here. The stream of consciousness is indivisible. We can't break it up and chunk it into little pieces. It's a whole thing. This is why the modern practice where individuals say they can multitask is just plain wrong. We can only attend to one thing in the stream of consciousness at a time, and we can't divide things out and say, I'll spend a little bit of my consciousness looking at the road ahead, a little bit looking at my cell phone, and still another bit of my consciousness snacking on a cheeseburger. It's a constant ebb and flow. It's continual. The stream of consciousness is also constantly changing. as we move through time, we are attending to potentially several different things in the stream of consciousness. We might have things that distract us. We might be trying to finish an assignment, but worried about the time pressure and having to leave for an appointment. We might be attending to other things, but we have to remember things in the stream of consciousness are forever and constantly changing. Definitely not static. In terms of things flowing in the stream of consciousness, it's also selective. We decide what we're going to attend to. If you are, for example, trying to pay attention to lecture and someone else is having a side conversation in class, that might be, some really good gossip. It's hard oftentimes to select to one thing and not pay attention to the other. Finally, the stream of consciousness is functional. We use the stream of consciousness, the information in the stream of consciousness, to make decisions about things that we need to take care of in our life to meet different functional needs. You might be in the process of later in the day making dinner. You're going to think about what you're cooking. You're going to be paying attention to things. The result will be something functional, a delicious dinner that will sustain you. Our final topic in our discussion of William James's contributions to psychology in this introductory section are James's thoughts on emotions. Now, for some reason, everyone that talks about William James uses an example, most likely one he used, about seeing a bear. You see a bear in the woods, the bears are dangerous critters, stay away from them. But if you see a bear, what do? James would posit, best thing to do is run away. But how does that figure into your experience of seeing a bear? So let's look at the scenario. So you see a bear. Well, maybe not that bear. How about this bear? Far more dangerous and threatening. So what do? You run. And as you start running, your heart starts accelerating. And your sympathetic nervous system starts coming into play. Your lungs start beating. You start taking in more oxygen. And then finally, you feel an emotion. Let's look at James's sequence and put it into context. So James says when we have any emotion, first it's based on what we've perceived. We see a bear. The action, we run. The perception causes physical reactions that we experience and label as emotions. In this case of the scary bear, we're frightened. James's theory is important because it changed the way people thought about emotions. People had thought that we perceive something, then we have the feeling, then we act. James's idea was somewhat controversial at the time, but it's fairly caught on, and although there have been successor models of emotions that have explained things in more detail, James's theory is still one of those that is a good way of looking at human emotions. In our introductory section, we learned a little bit about William James, the man, looked at his ideas of stream of consciousness and emotions, and pragmatism. In the following videos, we're going to look at his ideas about habits, free will, and the self. See you next time. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved. Take care now. Bye.